All right, so we're going to talk about how the crop and material flows through the combine, how you get your residue, how that crop is processed into residue, or how it's threshed and cleaned and ends up into the grain tank. So first, whether we have a draper, a row crop head, a corn head, or an auger platform, it all has to come into the feeder house. So we have that nice transition into our feeder house. Our feeder house chain spins and that crop is carried up into the machine through the bottom side of the feeder house floor. Each one of these slats grabs that crop and pulls that crop up into the feeder house, up into the feed accelerator. Now, right now our feeder house is in the lowered position, but it's a floating mid-floor, so if we get a big wad of crop or something, that mid-floor is going to float a little bit and help bring that bigger clump of material up into the feed accelerator. When we get to the feed accelerator, the purpose of the feed accelerator is to help in that transition from where our feeder house pivots up into that into the feeding section of the rotor. It also helps spread that crop out a little bit, flatten it out, just because those tin wings have like a small pinch point in there and transitions that crop into the front part of our rotor.
One thing I will want to preface this with is a misadjusted head can really cause a lot of difficulties when you're trying to get your combine set. So making sure that your header, and we'll cover that in another video, but making sure that your header is properly adjusted and properly set will make a big difference on how your combine performs. But like Chris said, there's several adjustments. We covered them in the pre-crop settings around the outside of the machine, so reference that video if you need to brush up on what needs to be done and how things need to be set that way. But once we get that crop into the feed accelerator and into the front feeding part of the rotor, we're going to transition around to the side, and we're going to talk about what happens actually inside the machine. So once we've come off of that feed accelerator, so that feed accelerator, kind of the name just basically is just that. It grabs that crop off the feeder house, it accelerates it, and there's 3 ramps underneath that feed accelerator that get that crop roughly 300 degrees started into the rotor, okay? And then you've got those ears on the front of that rotor, they're called the feeding section, that kind of help separate out that crop and get it in a more of an even condition, so that when it gets to the threshing part of the rotor, that you're going to have a similar size mat of material coming in there so that it can do an even and efficient job. So what's going to happen in here in this concave area where the threshing elements are, this is where 100% of the threshing is going to get done. So getting the kernel off the cob, getting the beans out of the pods, getting the wheat out of the head, that's all going to happen right here. Okay, 100% of the threshing is done here, and 90% of the separating is done here. So what I mean by that, again, it's got to be completely threshed, and then 90% of that crop should fall down onto these shoe augers, which we'll go into more detail on those a little bit later in the video. But in this front section, this is 100% of the threshing, 90% of the separating. Once if that grain falls down on the shoe auger, they're going to get carried back to the cleaning shoe. And from there, if it remains in the rotor, so that mog or material other than grain is hopefully getting carried back in the rotor. And what that 10% of that remaining crop that needs to be separated, that's going to happen on back here. So we're going to transition on back to the back part of the rotor.
So we have our 3 sections of our rotor. Lucas covered our feeding section, which is where our 3 ears divide that crop mat into 3 different passageways to go through the rotor and the concaves. Which each crop mat should make about 2.5 revolutions over the threshing section. Then it gets back here to the separating section. So as that crop mat advances towards the back of the machine, the separator tines spin that crop. It's kind of a convex or an eccentric, if you will. The crop gets pinched down here at the bottom and releases at the top in the veins. So it kind of pulls that grain to the outside when it's opening and closing that crop mat as it spins through the machine. The crop mat's going to spin roughly 4 or 5 times through over the separator grates before it meets the discharge beater coming out of the back of the rotor. Whatever free grain comes out of the separator grates in the separator section is either going to fall directly onto the front of the cleaning shoe, or it's going to hit the return pan, and that return pan will shake it forward. But we'll talk about that more later in the video.
So now we've got the chopper opened up, and we're standing in front of the chopper at the back of the cleaning shoe. So what we want to talk about in here is the discharge beater. Okay, so if the discharge beater, you kind of follow the camera around up here, the discharge beater looks a lot like the feed accelerator. Looks very similar in construction and design, but its function is a lot different. So the job of the discharge beater is to get that mog or material other than grain out of the rotor. And there is a grate underneath of it. So as it discharge beater, so it's spinning top forward, and then the bottom is coming towards the rear. It's bringing that crop and it's pulling it out of the rotor, and it's coming underneath of that discharge beater. There is a grate under there, and that's kind of our last chance to save if there's any remaining kernels or beans left in there or wheat. That's kind of our last chance. So as that discharge beater pulls that crop across that grate, that's our last chance to kind of grab what remaining kernels remain in there. So as that discharge beater is spinning, it's going to throw that crop up against this pan up above here. And then as it hits that pan, it's going to be directed down, and it's going to get open. It's going to get shot into the opening of the chopper, which is right where we're standing at the moment. We got the chopper out of the way, but right here where we're standing would be the opening to the chopper. So once the rotor's done with it, that discharge beater is going to grab it, run it across that grate for one last chance to grab that remaining kernel. And then it's going to pitch it back here and hit this pan, and it's going to be diverted into the opening of the chopper.
So as that crop leaves that discharge beater, as Lucas just talked about earlier, it comes down into the opening of the chopper. We lowered the chopper back into the closed position so we can see that opening where that crop hits that chopper. So the chopper is spinning from the bottom up towards the back of the machine. So the material is going underneath that chopper as it gets processed. So right now we have our stationary knives in the open position, so that we're not doing too much chopping. But if we were to close those stationary knives, that crop would act like, or that stationary knife would act like a set of scissors with the rotating knives and chop that material up, and then it gets flung out the back into our power cast spreader or into our vane tailboard. Lucas is going to go around the other side of the machine and show the cob deflector door. So right now, the cob deflector door is being lowered into the corn position. So that prevents those corn cobs from spinning over the back of the chopper rotor and coming back into the cleaning shoe and damaging the cleaning shoe. If that was left in the raised position or soybean position, we would put holes in our chaffer element, and we wouldn't be doing a very good job cleaning our crop. So as the crop is processed through the chopper, it comes out our chopper outlet and meets our power cast spreader. So our power cast is spinning towards the inside, and then it fans that crop material out on the ground.
So we've kind of gone through the rotor and how that material other than grain gets sent on out the back. Well, once we get the grain out of the rotor, so right here in the very front, we've got our concave area. And remember, 100% of the threshing and 90% of the separating is done in this concave area. So what happens to that material is it's going to fall through these concave bars, and it's going to end up down in these shoe auger troughs. So there's 4 of these shoe auger troughs across the combine, and their sole job is to bring that corn or bring those beans from the front and bring them to the back. So we'll look down right in here, and we'll see that you can see these augers, how they come back here, and they actually dump that crop down onto the front of what we call our fixed front chaffer, okay? So the fixed front chaffer is just that, it's fixed, okay? We cannot adjust that. The fingers are welded, and they're at a specific angle that's set from the factory and cannot be changed. There is an optional adjustable front chaffer that you can be added from the aftermarket parts, but for right now we're going to talk about the fixed front chaffer. So that fixed front chaffer, again, really its job is to, again, start to continue that separation process. So we've got the material other than grain still on the rotor headed out the back, and we've got that grain with some other material other than grain down here on the shoe augers. Shoe augers carry them to the back, and then it's going to dump it onto that fixed front chaffer. Now that fixed front chaffer is shaking along with our chaffer, so it's in kind of an elliptical motion, sort of like this. So it's having to try to move that material towards the back, and the design or the hope is that the material is lighter, so your stalks, your leaves, your stems, those kind of things, they're lighter, so they're going to float to the top with that shaking motion, and then the grain is going to fall down through the fingers down onto our main chaffer. Now in a class 6 or 7 machine, so your 660, 670, your 760, 770, those have a fixed front chaffer only. When you get to the class 8 and the class 9 machines, those have a fixed front chaffer extension. Those are very helpful in wetter corn. They try to help carry some of that leafy material that's a little bit heavier, carry that further back so your chaffer doesn't work so hard. When we get down on the main chaffer, we'll talk about maybe there might be some times where those may need to come out if you're in some given conditions. But for right now, we're one just to understand that these shoe augers, they're going to bring that material to the back, and they're going to dump it on that fixed front chaffer. And then as that elliptical shaking motion of that chaffer is going to move that material other than grain to the back, and it's going to allow the corn to go to the bottom and fall through the fingers.
So you can see far up there at the back of our shoe augers, you see our raised front chaffer, our stationary chaffer, our fixed front chaffer, as people call it. And then here towards the back in the up position, you can see our front chaffer extension. Most of our free grain is going to come and fall into the front third of the chaffer. So most of our free grain is hopefully spilling out into the front and going down through the chaffer and onto the sieve. Whatever crop doesn't fall through the chaffer, right now we're in the full open position, so not too much is going to make it to the back of the chaffer. It's all going to go through. But if we were set properly in the field, most of the material other than grain is going to work its way back towards where we're standing at the rear of the chaffer. So keep in mind, this whole shoe is shaking in in kind of a circle pattern, and it's going to help stratify and lift and throw that mog and keep that heavier grain lower so it can fall through and separate from the fan blast. When we get towards the back here, we have our rear section of the chaffer that we manually adjust, and this is our last ditch effort to get some of that free grain down into our tailings in the back here. Whatever makes it over the rear of our chaffer is going into our chopper that we just showed you earlier. So if you're losing grain and have a bunch of grain on the ground, it's either going to come from your separator, you got separator loss, or we're losing it over the back of our chaffer element.
So one thing about this rear manually adjustable chaffer, it typically is it's adjusted right there that Chris just pointed out. It's typically going to be very closed down. That does a couple things for us. A, that's going to push and force more of the air to the front where we need it, because we've got a lot more material up in the front. So we need that fan blast to really do a good job and have most of that air available in the front. The other thing is, by the time we get to this closed down section here in the back, we should have gotten most of our grain separated out by this time. If this back part is open very much at all, typically what you're going to find is you're going to see a lot of material that you don't want to see in your grain tank, or you're going to have a lot of tailings load, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this one is manually adjustable, and it's typically going to be very closed down compared to the actual chaffer.
Usually run about 5 to 10 millimeters, so pretty closed down. So if our grain made it through our chaffer, it makes it to our sieve. It's the same style element, just the fingers are smaller, and it's slightly shorter. So this the length of the sieve stops about right in here. You can see it down in there where it stops. You can see, if you can really see in there, those fingers are smaller. They're about 1/4 of an inch shorter. So that's where our grain or mog that's fallen through the chaffer lands next. It lands on the sieve. So it's also turning in that circular motion and throwing that material up. so our fan blast can help separate it. So if anything that goes through our sieve is going to go into our clean grain, and we'll try and end up in our grain tank. Anything that didn't get separated out and fallen through the sieve is going to go into our tailings, and it will go either through the rethresher on a 8 or a 9 machine, or up through the tailings elevator and dump back into the rotor on a 6 or a 7 machine. So if anything made it through the chaffer, it's going to stay in the combine and get one more chance, or it's going to go up into the grain tank. While we're back here, we're also going to talk about our dividers, or our side hill kits. These dividers in here, this is a portion of the side hill kit that you can get that keeps that crop in its bay when we're on a hillside of a machine. That way the crop doesn't all run downhill and overload that side of the chaffer. We've got these dividers in here to kind of keep that crop in its assigned bay as it processes through the machine.
So again, the fan blast is being blown up through it's going to go through your sieve, and it's going to go up through your chaffer. So it has to go through the sieve and then get through the chaffer. That's how your air blast is going to go. So some of the air is diverted from the fan to that fixed portion, or the very front part of it, and then the rest of the air is diverted towards the back of the main chaffer. So again, there is a divider in there that kind of helps divert that air and split it up. But if it's going to get to the rear portion of your chaffer, it has to go through that sieve. So if you close the sieve down, you potentially are going to choke off some of the air that is going to the top chaffer as well. And we'll get more into that as we do our infield settings. But just keep in mind that, like Chris said, if it goes through the chaffer, you've caught it. And then if it goes through the sieve, it's in the grain tank. If it goes through the chaffer but not the sieve, then it's going to go into return, which we're going to talk about next. So we've got 2 elevators on our machine right now. So on a 780 or 790, I've got this rethresher mechanism, and I also have a clean grain. So it doesn't matter what machine I've got, I've always have a clean grain elevator. And anything that goes through that bottom sieve, so some guys call it the bottom screen or the sieve, that's going to drop and down to this auger right here at the bottom underneath the sieve. It's going to come across, and then that paddle chain is going to take it up, and then the fountain auger is going to dump it into the grain tank. Okay, so that you've caught it and you've put it in the grain tank. If it goes through the chaffer but not the sieve, so it goes down on the chaffer, or goes through the chaffer and goes down on the sieve, and it gets carried off the back of the sieve, it's going to slide on a pan down into this auger. Okay, on a class 6 or class 7 machine, that's going to be what we call our tailings return elevator. It's kind of angled up like this. It'll come up here and it will actually dump back in the rotor right here. So on a class 6 or class 7 machine, again, we'll talk more about this in our infield, but if you're seeing rotor loss and you're running a lot of tailings, that could be a contributing factor. So on a class 8 or class 9 machine, this is what we call our rethresher or tailings return. So this comes up this elevator. Chris talked about this in one of our other videos on the outside settings, but there's kind of a little mini cylinder in there with, like, there's RAS bars that are on the front here, and there's a little mini cylinder that's turning in there. So if I've got some bean pods or something like that aren't completely threshed, hopefully that's what's going to happen in this rethresher. So once it comes through the rethresher, it's going to fall down onto a lower auger. That lower auger is going to take it across, and it's going to dump it back up on that shoe pan underneath the rotor. So the back part of the rotor where those separator tines are, that's where that material is getting dumped. So if I'm running a heavy tailings return on a class 8 or class 9, I'm making my chaffer work extra hard if I'm running a lot of material other than grain through that return and dumping it back on my return pan. So if I go through my chaffer, I've caught it. It's going to go one of 2 places. Again, through the sieve, it ends up in the clean grain elevator and goes to the tank. If it doesn't go through the sieve and goes over the back, it's going to end up in tailings, and it's going to get reprocessed through the combine. Now, whether you've got a class 6 or class 7 machine, or a class 8 or class 9 machine, is going to determine the path of that material after that.
So as Lucas just mentioned, our tailings is getting dumped back onto our return pan. That's right here. That's shaking that grain back to the front of the chaffer. This is our tailings return auger. Now there's holes a lot smaller than this all through the bottom of that auger tube that helps evenly dump that tailings out onto the return pan. That way all of it doesn't dump on the left side, or all of it doesn't get carried across over here to the right side. So that material falls down, hits the return pan, gets shaken back towards the front, falls down onto our raised front chaffer, or front fixed chaffer, and then meets that air blast and goes through that cleaning process again. Thanks for watching, coming out with us today in our combine series. If you haven't done so, go back and watch some of our other videos, such as concave leveling, power shutdown, crop flow, combine settings adjust. Feel like there's a lot of valuable information out there we can share with you.
Yep. So again, thanks for watching, and we appreciate it. Again, if you got any specific questions, don't be afraid to call your local Sloan implement dealer. They can help you with any specific questions that you might have. And again, we wish you a safe and successful harvest.